to the Putting Your Business on the Map podcast. I'm your podcast host, Landon Blake, a land surveyor living and working in Central California. Happy to have you here. Let's go ahead and dive right into today's episode. The title of episode 22 is Domain Expertise versus Business Expertise, or why land surveyors suck at running their shop. Most surveyors do anyways. So this topic was inspired by a conversation I had with my business partner, Brian Leiser. I think it's really important. That's why I wanted to devote a full episode to it. I am recording this episode at home, so it's possible that you will hear my dogs barking, or my crazy Mexican wife screaming, or other random Blake household noises. So let me apologize for that in advance. So what are we talking about today? We are going to talk about what is domain expertise. Then we're going to talk about what is business expertise. And we're going to talk about what happens when you don't have both of those and you try and run a business. Because I've learned that the hard way the last 4.5 years. And then we're going to talk about how do you fix a lack of business expertise, because that's what I think most land surveyors suffer from when they go to start a business. What we are not talking about is how you become a domain expert. I'm not going to do a deep dive on that. I think most of the people listening to this podcast are probably already fairly experienced land surveyors or on the way to becoming experienced land surveyors, so I don't want to bore you with that. So just a few disclaimers, couple disclaimers to get out of the way here. I want to fully acknowledge that I'm still working on my own business expertise. So when I started RH 4.5 years ago, I thought I knew how to run a survey business, and I was wrong. I didn't. Now, I consider myself to be a good land surveyor and an excellent boundary surveyor. And I felt like I was an effective project surveyor, so I could run projects in small teams. And I thought those two things, my skills as a land surveyor and as a project surveyor, project manager, meant I was qualified to run a business, and it didn't. I wasn't. And so I've learned that the hard way the last 4.5 years. So I want to just be completely honest with the audience today. I'm not trying to get up on a soapbox, and I don't want to feel like a hypocrite. Running a business is the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I think I talked about that in episode 1 or 2 of the podcast. It's the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, and it continually humbles me to such an extent that sometimes I wonder if I want to keep going. I mean, I am getting my face punched on a pretty regular basis. Now, I think it makes me a better person in the long run, but it is very difficult. And I think I mentioned this before on the podcast. I used to tell people being married was the hardest thing I'd ever done. And I married a good woman. I love her. She's the center of my universe. I love her very much. But marriage is hard. It's one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. But I think running this business is even harder than that. It's even harder than having a good marriage. You know, I tell people good marriage is a lot of work. Now, it may be, and I think this is true, that there are some people that get married that just, they just dovetail nicely. They just fit together nicely, and maybe it's not as much work for them. But I think for 80 or 90% of us, marriage is really hard work. And I married across cultures, and it's been a lot of work. But it's worth it. It's worth the work, I have a good marriage, and I love my wife, and it's worth the work. And so I think, running a small business is like, that's a lot of work. I think it's worth it. It's not worth it to everybody. I realize that now more than ever, I think. But it's worth it to me. But that doesn't mean it isn't hard. It is hard. So I just want to... Man, that was a longer confession than I intended. Full disclaimer. I am still figuring out the business expertise part of this. And that's why I wanted to... my partner Brian talked to me about it, and that's why I wanted to talk about it on the episode, because it's important and I don't have it all figured out. I am also still working on my word whiskers. So, I think so is my favorite. I'm going to try and work on those today. If you hear me pause, it's because I'm struggling not to say a word whisker. So be patient with me, please. Eventually, I will have mastered that, and I will no longer need to include that warning in the introduction of the podcast. I hope. We'll see. We'll see how long it takes. Hopefully, I'll master my word whiskers before I stop the podcast. All right. So I want to use an illustration here at the beginning before we dive into that first main part of the episode. And I'm not sure where I heard this. It might have been on the Econ Talk podcast, which I listen to and I highly recommend, by Russ Roberts. It's called Econ Talk. I might have heard this on Econ Talk. Pretty sure that's where I heard it. And here's kind of how the illustration goes. If you're a good cook and you love to cook, friends and family will tell you to start a catering company or a restaurant. And I've seen that happen to people I know. My wife is an excellent cook and a good baker. And I have a friend named Tony who's just one of the best cooks I've ever. I mean, he just creates incredible food. And people will tell him, and others like him, you should start a restaurant or you should start a catering business. And the friends and family that do that, they typically have good intentions, but it's often really horrible advice. Now, why would I say that? A lot of restaurants fail. Why? Well, for one thing, it's a low margin business. In other words, there's not a lot of profit in it. And the other reason is it's really hard to do. Like all kinds of businesses, it's hard, and I think running a restaurant is harder than a lot of other kinds of businesses, so it's extremely difficult. And one of the reasons I think those restaurants fail, and one of the reasons why it's difficult, is running a successful restaurant requires a much broader set of skills than just cooking. So cooking, food prep and cooking and baking, you could say those are the core skills that you need to run a restaurant. That's the domain expertise. That's the technical part, right? Knowing all about food. And by the way, there's a lot more to that than people realize. My wife, she doesn't as much anymore, but she used to watch a lot of the cooking shows. Chopped and Hell's Kitchen and some of those other shows, and I enjoyed watching them with her. Bar Rescue is another one. And when you watch those shows, you realize being a good cook is really tough. Just being a good chef is extremely difficult. But that's just one part. That's just the core set of skills. That's just the domain expertise. It doesn't actually help you run a restaurant. So what are the other skills you need to run a successful restaurant? And by the way, I've never run a restaurant, but I did some research online about this. And so here's some things you have to, I think there's actually, I'll try and remember to see if Carly can find it for the show notes, but there's actually a book about starting your own restaurant and why it's so hard. We'll see if we can find the title of that book and get it in the show notes. But so what are other skills that you need to run a successful restaurant? Accounting and money management, customer service, team building and managing a team, purchasing food and managing food inventory, designing a menu and managing a menu, managing your specials and other parts of your menu, marketing your restaurant, buying and maintaining your kitchen equipment, which is expensive, running a kitchen schedule and a waitstaff schedule. So you see, being a good cook is vital to running a successful restaurant, but it's also a very small part of running a food business, right? There's all those other parts. And I would suspect if you talked to someone that was a great cook that started a restaurant, what they'll tell you is, I don't spend as much time cooking as I want. I spend most of my time doing all this other stuff. And I think that's true of me as a land surveyor. Now, I still do some survey work, but it's not as much as I want or as much as I thought. I spend a huge amount of my time on the other stuff that is involved in running any small business. Scheduling, accounting, client service, building and managing a team. Now, for me, the trade-offs are worth that sacrifice. In my dream job, I would just come in and make beautiful maps all day. Be out in the field in the woods, and I would come in and make beautiful maps. And that's all I would ever do. I wouldn't do billing or scheduling or anything else. But I also get the freedom and autonomy that comes with being a business owner, and I get to have the satisfaction of doing great work for our clients and watching my people grow to reach their full potential. And so for me, those other benefits of being a business owner outweigh the sacrifice I make by not getting to do the technical work I enjoy all the time. So I imagine it's the same thing when you start a restaurant. Probably not too long after you start a restaurant, if it's mildly successful, you're spending a lot of your time doing stuff that isn't directly related to food prep or cooking or baking, right? You're doing the other stuff that comes with running a business. So I think that's a good illustration that helps us to understand the differences between domain expertise and business expertise and why you need both if you're going to run a successful small business. Now we're going to take a deep dive. We're going to take a deep dive, pretty deep dive, into each one of those. So we're going to take 5 or 10 minutes and we'll talk about domain expertise, and we'll take 5 or 10 minutes and talk about business expertise. And then we'll wrap up the podcast by talking about why do you need both and what happens if you're a surveyor and you don't have enough business expertise? How might you fix that? But I thought that illustration about being a good cook and running a restaurant was a good way to kind of introduce those topics and help us wrap our brains around it. Well, what I'm going to do now is we're going to take a quick break, 1 or 2 minute break, and we're going to hear from our episode sponsor, which I appreciate the sponsorship. And then we'll get back into the episode and we'll talk about what is domain expertise. I'll give you a definition and we'll kind of flesh it out a little bit, flesh out that definition. Would you like to manage your land surveying or civil engineering data in a GIS? Do you work for a small organization or utility company? Have people told you that there isn't a way to get started with GIS for your data unless you have a $3 million budget and a dedicated ArcGIS server in your basement? That just isn't true. You can get started with GIS for a few $1,000s using QGIS and the expert consulting advice from the team at Redefine Horizons. We've been using open source software like QGIS to manage land surveying and civil engineering data for over 20 years. Call us to see just how easy it is to start. We can help you do an initial GIS needs assessment for your organization and introduce you to QGIS on the desktop for no charge. You can find our team on the web at www.rh-survey.com. All right, now that we've heard from our sponsor, we're going to dive back in here to our episode with that second main point. What is domain expertise? So I'm going to give you I let one slip. I'm going to give you a definition of domain expertise. Domain expertise is the knowledge and know-how or skills of a specific profession, business, or technical arena as opposed to just general knowledge that people have. There's a great Econ Talk podcast. I'll try and remember to have Carly put it in the show notes that talks about the difference between knowledge and know-how. It's excellent, and I encourage you to listen to it. But know-how is actual skill that you can't just easily transfer to another person. So the example they use in the Econ Talk podcast is, Michael Jordan could spend a ton of time teaching you, telling you how to shoot a three-pointer on the basketball court. He can tell you about that as much as he wants, probably, but that's not going to make you a great three-point shooter. So that's know-how. In other words, it's not crystallized knowledge that you could convey to somebody like in the pages of a book. So domain expertise is some of both. It's knowledge and know-how or skills. And it's about a specific area or arena. Okay. So as an example, at Redefine Horizons, the company I run with my partner Brian Leiser, two of the things that we are domain experts in are boundary surveying and land title and GIS and cartography. So those are two areas or arenas that we have worked to become experts in. CEQA is another one. CEQA and land use planning is another area. Now we're in the process of building our CEQA expertise, but those are examples. UAV mapping and LiDAR data is another area that we are building our domain expertise in. It's one of the reasons why I hired Brian, is he had some existing knowledge and know-how there. So that's what domain expertise is. Specific knowledge and know-how. It often requires years of dedicated study, practice, and experience. One of the reasons surveying is expensive and getting more expensive is because we are not training enough surveyors. And to be a good boundary surveyor, for example, that process takes years. It takes years. I'll try and remember in a PYBO Team Extra to tell you guys a story about a law firm that asked me to come, and in 1 hour, on a 1 hour lunch, they wanted me to teach their paralegals how to be experts at reading and interpreting land descriptions. And I had to explain to the people at the law firm, I can't do that in an hour, and they're like, why not? I'm like, yeah, that takes years of study. You can't just do it in an hour. So I'll try and do a PYBO Team Extra, and we can talk a little bit about that. But so now that doesn't mean all areas of domain expertise are like that, but I think a lot are. To be a world-class gymnast or an amazing carpenter or a fantastic chef, all of that takes years. It's not hours or days or weeks or even months. It takes years. So there's domain expertise. That's one of the reasons why it's valuable, is because it requires a large investment. So just as an example, I don't run our IT systems at RH, and I don't do our bookkeeping. We have a dedicated IT consultant, and we have a CPA, certified public accountant, that does our taxes for us. Why? I don't have the years to invest or the desire to invest in becoming an expert IT person and a public accountant. I understand that domain expertise requires years and years of experience. And I want to make that investment. I'm a land surveyor. That's why I outsource those particular capabilities. I think even simple businesses require some domain expertise. And so I'll give you an example of that. Let's just say you want to run a delivery service in the downtown of a large city. So Sacramento is the closest really big city we have. So let's just say you're going to run a urgent, overnight or same day delivery service between businesses in downtown Sac or in the Sacramento area, right? You might think, well, like, how hard is that, right? You buy a bike or a small car and you're in business. But think about what core skills would be needed to do that well, right? Scheduling, logistics, navigation, right? Good client service, all of those things. So there are core skills that you need to be able to do that. So why is domain expertise important? That's that set of core skills in your domain expertise, or you could call them core capabilities. That is what your business uses to deliver value to clients. Now, I'm speaking about businesses here, but this is also applicable to surveyors that are working for government or nonprofit. So you could say core skills or capabilities are used by your organization to deliver value to stakeholders if you don't work for a business. So if you're a business, it's how you deliver value to clients. If you're in a nonprofit or a government, it's how you deliver value to your stakeholders. So for example, one of our core capabilities at Redefine Horizons is the ability to properly locate real property boundaries on the surface of the earth. That's a core capability we have. And people will pay for it because it's not easy, right? It takes years and years of experience to be able to do that well. So as I mentioned, there's a so. As I mentioned, even simple businesses, I think, have to have at least one or two ways core skills that they use to deliver value. And as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, in the introduction, don't forget, you may look at a business and think, oh, well, how hard could that be? How hard could that core skill or set of core skills be? Like, anybody can do that. It's probably harder than you think. There's a business around the corner from me. They rent portable toilets. You might drive by that little business. They got a little yard around the corner from my house, and you could drive by that business and think, oh, that poor guy. He rents toilets for a living. He probably is a high school dropout or whatever. But when I drive by that business, especially now that I've owned my own business, I think to myself, I bet that's hard work. I bet there's a lot to learn about portable toilets and how to maintain them and rent them and keep them clean and get them to the right place at the right time. I bet that running that business and doing well is way harder than you think, even though it's just toilets. And I respect that man or woman. I don't know. It could be a woman. I respect that business owner. And when I drive by that little yard around the corner from my house, I tip my hat every time I go by because I understand now as a business owner how hard that is. Right? And there's probably more, as I mentioned, there's more to running a good portable toilet rental business than you realize or that I realize. And so I approach the entire business world now with that type of humility, or I try to, because I know that core set of skills is probably way more difficult than I realize. All right, let me just glance at my notes here and make sure I haven't forgot anything. So domain expertise is about core skills or capabilities. And remember, that's a fundamental way you provide value to your client. And ultimately, if you don't deliver value to your client or your customer or your stakeholders, you're going to die as an organization. That's how it works. So domain expertise is vitally important. That is, in essence, what you are selling. It's the core piece of what you're selling. And I want to talk about, we'll do a PYBO team extra on something called the business model canvas. I'll try and remember to have Carly put a link to that in the show notes, but it's a cool book and it's a template that helps you think about business models, and it makes you think a little bit about your core capabilities. And so it'd be cool to do a PYBO team extra on that. We'll try and do that. I would also like to do a future episode on how businesses leverage core skills and capabilities to provide value, and we'll look specifically at surveying and mapping. Maybe we'll do that as a bonus episode for the supporters on Patreon. Let me think about it, but I mention it here so I don't forget. Okay, so who in your organization should have domain expertise? I think it needs to be a decision maker or a high-level manager. I think that's really important. That person needs to have a reasonable measure of authority over the technical decisions that are being made in the business. And in California and in most other states in the United States, that is required under state law. So we call that responsible charge in California. In other words, you have to have a surveyor that's an owner of the business or in a high position of high authority, and they have to be in charge of the land surveying decisions that are made. I talked a little bit about that in episode 21 on Lead from the Front. And I tell in that episode, I told survey managers, if you are working as a survey manager and you don't have the authority to put yourself in the field 2 days a month, you are not really in responsible charge, and that's what the law requires. I think that's important. I think you can see businesses fail or make big mistakes when they don't have the right, when the decision makers don't have the right type of domain expertise. Big mistakes happen. I think you could see this a little bit with Boeing. I think some of the failures at Boeing, the airplane manufacturer, have become because they had C-suite folks, executive managers with good business background that were worried about the numbers, and they didn't have enough experience in manufacturing and design in the C-suite, in the executive management team, and I think that's why they got into some of those problems. I'd like to do another PYBO team extra on what that means in a land surveying business. What happens when the domain expert doesn't have reasonable authority over technical work. That we could certainly do 10 or 15 minutes on that. And by the way, as a side note, I think a lot of large engineering companies screw this up on a pretty regular basis. So they have somebody in charge of land surveying work that has some domain expertise, but they're not really the ones with the authority to make decisions. And that's a problem. And that's one of the reasons why big design companies screw up land surveying. And I see it happen on a pretty regular basis. I've got some stories about that on the Redefine Horizons marketing channel. So you can listen to those if you're curious. But one of the reasons large design firms dork up surveying aspects of their large infrastructure projects is because they don't have a land surveyor with decision-making authority at the table, and that causes problems. You need to think about the kinds of problems that can happen when you don't have a person with domain expertise at the right level of authority in your organization. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about that because I'm close to the Bay Area. I see this often with Bay Area startups. So I get approached maybe once a year or twice a year by a tech company from the Bay, a startup, and they've got some problem they're trying to fix. And when I see those folks venture out too far outside of the software development or hardware development world, they tend to approach problems with a large amount of hubris. I'm just going to be honest. And I'm not saying that's all bad. They do amazing things in the Silicon Valley. And sometimes the disruption they bring about is healthy and it's good for clients and consumers. But I frequently see those startups fail because they do not approach the domain expertise of a new business area with the appropriate amount of humility. Again, I'm not saying that they can't change the world or that their software can't change the world. I'm just saying it's harder than they realize most of the time. What happens is they overestimate the value of their software design expertise and they underestimate the value of domain expertise in whatever domain they're trying to disrupt. So I think there's a balance between innovation and challenging the status quo and the respect for domain expertise. Now, there are some examples. SpaceX and Elon Musk and SpaceX have done a really amazing job of disrupting the rocket market, the vehicle, the transport to space market. I think SpaceX has done a really great job of disrupting that kind of stodgy, ossified, existing market. And, they're giving folks like Lockheed Martin and Boeing and Northrop Grumman a run for their money. And I think that's great. But I think even Elon Musk has had to admit, for example, with Tesla, when it came time to produce automobiles at scale, I think Elon Musk had to acknowledge that he underestimated that challenge, right? He didn't have the domain expertise of an automotive manufacturer, and it was harder to make 10,000 cars a year than he realized. So there's a balance. I think it's healthy to challenge the status quo in the marketplace, and we try and do that here at Redefine Horizons. One of the things we're trying to do as a business is challenge the status quo a little bit, shake things up. I think that's good. I'm a little bit contrarian and a little bit of a hothead contrarian. And so I want to shake the market up a little bit. I think it's good. I think it's healthy. But you can do that with humility and respect. And I've gotten more humble as I've done it. Another example is, Walmart attempted to go into the small clinic healthcare provider business. They rolled out some small clinics at their stores. And it was a really great idea. I think one of the reasons why Walmart failed at it is because they didn't have enough domain expertise in the healthcare industry, and they underestimated the challenge there. And you can read about that. There's been some recent articles about it. But I think that's another example from outside of Silicon Valley. So I'm going to try and do a PUIBO Team Extra and talk about two stories of this. So I'll tell you about a tech startup that was trying to disrupt utility locating using tow-behind GPR and AI interpretation of GPR data. I can tell that company approached us. And then I'll tell you about another tech startup that was trying to automate the creation of site plans by digesting and automatically interpreting land use regulations. And I think both those problems, although the ideas were intriguing, I think they were both really hard problems to solve in ways that the tech companies didn't understand. And part of the reason they were coming to us at RH is because they had realized they didn't have the right domain expertise. And they came to talk to me, and I sat down. I spent several hours with both companies, owners of both companies, explaining why I thought they had some really tough challenges to solve. We just recently did this with another really interesting startups owner that is developing AI tools to automatically extract information from survey maps. And again, it's a super cool concept. I think those folks underestimate the challenge because they don't have enough domain expertise. And we get approached because we have a fairly good presence on the internet, and we're close to the Silicon Valley, so we get approached by those kinds of companies. So I'll try and do a PYBO Team Extra on that. So what's the takeaway from this part of the podcast? And the takeaway is domain expertise is really important. It's hard to acquire. And if you think you're going to go disrupt another market segment or market area, be humble, because domain expertise is really critical. And I told you in this episode, we're not doing a deep dive on how to acquire domain expertise, because I think most of the folks listening to this podcast are probably already already have the domain expertise or they're on that path. But it is important. And I think you need both to run a successful surveying and mapping business. You need domain expertise and business expertise. We're going to take a break, short 1 or 2 minute break. We're going to hear from our sponsor. And then when we come back, we'll talk about what is business expertise. I'll give you a definition. We'll flesh that out a little bit. Google Earth is a great tool. It is the software that brought the power of geospatial data to the masses. A lot of land surveyors use Google Earth to manage their data. However, your organization can quickly outgrow Google Earth for survey data management. Is there a better way? Yes, you can use QGIS and open source desktop GIS to manage your organization's land surveying and civil engineering data. The team at Redefine Horizons can help you do that. They've got decades of experience managing land surveying and civil engineering data using open source GIS tools. The best part is this doesn't need to cost $1 million. It is very easy and inexpensive for your organization to get started with QGIS. As a bonus, QGIS can import and export the KML files used in Google Earth. That means you can still use Google Earth when it makes sense. Check out Redefine Horizons on the web at www.rh-survey.com and let us know how we can help get you started with QGIS. There's no charge for your initial consultation. Now that we've heard from our sponsor, we'll get into that next main point. I believe this is point number 3, main point of the episode, or number 2, sorry. What is business expertise? I want to give you a definition and flesh that out a little bit. We can talk briefly about why it's important. Business expertise is knowledge and know-how about running a business. And remember when we talked about domain expertise, knowledge and know-how are not the same thing. So you need both. And I would describe business expertise, one of the things that makes it different from domain expertise is it should be transferable to other types of businesses or at least closely related businesses. So for example, you should be able to take the business expertise that you acquire running one design consulting business like architecture to another like structural engineering, right? Those domains, the technical domains are different, but the businesses are similar. And so the business expertise should transfer. And in theory, this is why schools offer business degrees, right? Degrees in business. They're trying to provide you with the business expertise that would be applicable at different types of businesses. So even though the domain, that the technical domains of the businesses are very different, there should, in theory, the schools teach you some business expertise that is transferable between businesses. And I think that's true. I think there is some expertise that can be transferred to different kinds of businesses. If my employees ever decide to get rid of me, which is a possibility I can't rule out, and I would hope I could take my experience the last 5 years running Redefine Horizons, the business, and use that to either start or help someone run a different kind of business, even if it wasn't land surveying. And I would probably look for a closely related business, but even if it was a very different business like a winery or an olive orchard, I would hope, I would hope that my business expertise from Redefine Horizons would transfer at some level to running those other kinds of businesses. So what does business expertise include? I got a bulleted list here. I'm just going to run down. Marketing, business development. We talked about that in the last episode. Scheduling, accounting and money management, workload forecasting, workload management, project management, team building, training, human resources, strategy and tactics. So much. This is why running a business is so hard. There are so many different things you need to, if not master, acquire a comfortable level of skill in, and it's just really hard. It's a huge effort, and it's been very humbling for me. I had no idea how hard it was. Sometimes in popular culture, you'll hear people complain about how much we pay CEOs, and we probably do pay CEOs too much. But when I hear those complaints, one of the things I think is those people that are complaining about how much money CEOs make have never run even a small business, because it is incredibly hard. And I imagine running a huge company is much harder than running a small one. So I do not underestimate the challenge. It's just so hard. I have so much respect for people that can run a successful small business. I told you a little bit about my wife's auto mechanic in Manteca, California. So much respect for that, man. So much respect. It's really hard to do this. And the reason why is because of all those things that business expertise includes, right? So how do you acquire, how do you acquire business expertise? I wanted to talk about that a little bit because I think that's something that a lot of surveyors lack. Even surveyors like me that were running small teams or that own their own business. I think a lot of us lack business expertise. That's why we suck at running our shop. Because we might be great land surveyors from a technical perspective. In other words, we might have great domain expertise, but we have not thought about or mastered these other things that are included in business expertise. So if that's true, how do you get it? How do you go? If you're listening to this podcast as a land surveyor and you're saying, you know what, Landon's right. I am a great surveyor, but I really need to acquire more business expertise. How could you do that? Some of that I think you can do through education and learning. And I'm not saying you have to go get your master's degree or your bachelor's degree in business. You could do that. But I think you can also learn a lot. So I devour business books. I've read so many business books. I devour them. Some of my favorites are Blue Ocean Strategy, Range. There's a book called Range that I really liked. I'm trying to think about some other ones. I just finished The Culture Code, The Innovation Stack. There's another book I just finished. Anyways, some great books. I'll try and have Carly work with me and we'll get a list together in the show notes. So I devour business books and they help a lot. I listen to all kinds of business podcasts. Disney Magic is one of them. Econ Talk is another one I listen to. I listen to podcasts about marketing. I subscribe to and read business magazines. So I subscribe to the HBR, the Harvard Business Review. I subscribe to MIT Sloan and MIT Technology Review. And I also read the Wall Street Journal every day. I subscribe to the Economist magazine. So I really make a huge effort to self-educate. And I'm not saying that you have to do all that, but it helps me. And there's so much to learn. I just get overwhelmed. I mean, my audiobook playlist on Audible has 52 business books in it. I mean, there's just so much to learn there. So I think you can acquire some of this through education and learning, whether it's formal or self-taught. And I encourage you to do that if you're a land surveyor. And then some of this I think you just acquire through experience running businesses. Now here's what I wish I would have done. Now I did run a little small business on the side, teaching. So I would teach at conferences and events, surveying conferences and events around the Western United States. And I did that for a few years before I started Redefine Horizons. And that helped. But I wish I would have done more. I wish I would have done more with the side hustle. So what I would tell you is if you're thinking about starting your own survey business at some point, start a side hustle. And it doesn't have to be surveying. I don't care if you run a lemonade stand on the weekends. Get a business. And here's the key with the side hustle. Treat it like a real business. Like go buy insurance, rent the office space in your house, put together a schedule, hire an employee, even if it's cash under the table or someone on Upwork, so you learn how to deal with an employee. Treat that side hustle like a real business because the knowledge that you're going to gain from that exercise is going to be so valuable. I wish I would have done that. I wish I would have more treated my side hustle more like a real business and been a little more engaged with it before I just dove right into the pool. So education and training is important. But I also think just run a business, any kind of business. It doesn't have to be surveying, like I said. It could be a lemonade stand, or help a family member or a friend run their business. Just get that experience so valuable. It's going to save you so much pain and suffering when you finally decide to start your own surveying and mapping business. So who in your organization should have business expertise? I think it needs to be a decision maker or a high level manager, just like someone with domain expertise. They have to have a reasonable measure of authority over the business decisions that are being made, who to hire, what prices to charge, how much money to keep in the bank. I think you see with venture capital funding, and I see this because I'm close to the Bay Area, the investor that's providing the funding often provides the business expertise to the startup founder, or they require that the startup founder get that business expertise as a condition of the funding. And that's because people that invest venture capital understand you need both. You need domain expertise and business expertise. So that's why business expertise is important. Now I want to take a quick break here. Now that we know what business expertise and domain expertise are, I want to talk for a few minutes about why everyone is trying to hire the same land surveyor. And we could do a whole episode on this, but I'm going to try and keep it to 5 minutes. So there's another one. If you follow me on LinkedIn, you'll know I talk about this occasionally. I get inundated or flooded with solicitations from recruiters because so many engineering companies are looking for a land surveyor like me. So why? Why is everybody looking for a guy or gal like me? I mean, there's I don't know if there's 50 or 100 or 200 of those open positions in California right now, but there's way more openings than there are people like me that can fill the jobs. And so what's going to happen is some engineering companies are going to get out of the surveying business. I don't think they realize that yet, but they're going to figure it out because there's more surveyors retiring than coming into the profession, and we've hamstrung ourselves with one-man field crews, and there are some engineering companies that are not going to find a surveyor. That's all there is to it. I can't sugarcoat that. So why is everybody trying to find a guy or a gal like me? It's because the combination of business expertise and domain expertise is really hard. It's really hard to acquire both of those, and it's undervalued by most employers. Most surveyors that are domain experts, I shouldn't say most, but a lot of surveyors, I think the majority, so more than half, don't want to be business experts. They want to be domain experts, and they don't want to worry about team building and scheduling and training and strategy and managing a team. They just want to go in and do survey work. So when you find a person that has both of those, that person is really valuable. So you can think about a Venn diagram with two circles, and in one is business expertise, the other is domain expertise, and everybody's looking for that where those circles intersect. They're looking for the person that has both of those, and that's a small intersection. If you take those two circles, they don't overlap very much in most people. You're looking for a rare candidate. And I would add to really what those engineering companies really need, if you take those two circles, so you have business expertise and domain expertise, you can add a third circle, which is effective leadership. And now you have an even smaller intersection. So most engineering companies want somebody that is an expert in the domain, so an expert land surveyor, licensed with 10 plus years of experience. They want somebody that's good at the business, so they can find work, write proposals, manage a schedule. And then they want somebody that can be a good leader, inspire people, train people, motivate people. That's a very small set of individuals. I would say, I think I'm pretty comfortable saying this, I think there's less than 25 of those people in California. There's less than 25 people that I know, and I've been in California for a long time, 20 years as a surveyor. I might be able to get you a list of 25 licensed surveyors that fall into that intersection of those three circles: domain expertise, business expertise, and effective leadership. And it might not be 25. It might not be 10. It's pretty sobering. It's sobering. And that's one of the reasons why we're trying to grow those people from inside our own business. And one of the things that we do that I'm really proud of, we can talk about this more in a future episode, is we're trying to teach our young surveyors about business and leadership, not just domain expertise. Because we understand how rare it is to find people that can do both or all three of those. So I might just do a short PYBOTM extra. We'll draw the Venn diagram, and I'll talk about why it's hard to find people that can fill all three of those, that fall in the intersection of all three of those circles. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to talk about in just to kind of wrap up is what happens when you don't have both domain expertise and business expertise, and how do you fix that? So what happens, that is my favorite word. What happens when you have a lack of domain expertise? A lack of domain expertise is going to weaken your ability to turn core capabilities into the value delivered to your clients. And remember, that in essence is what you are selling. So if you think about a salad, you buy a salad at a restaurant, your core capabilities, your domain expertise is like the lettuce. Everything else is the fixing and the dressings. So imagine they bring you a salad with no lettuce or no leafy greens. It's just croutons and dressing. You wouldn't be very happy. So domain expertise is critical. That is what you are selling. That is the core part of what you are selling. Another reason domain expertise is critical is a lack of domain expertise will cause you to overestimate your ability to perform and underestimate the challenges. We talked a little bit about how I see that in tech startups from the Silicon Valley. They routinely overestimate their ability to deliver and underestimate their challenges because they don't have the appropriate domain expertise. Another problem from a lack of domain expertise in an organization is it's going to expose your team to unnecessary liability, your organization to unnecessary liability. So you're not going to appropriately manage risk if you don't have the right kind of domain expertise. But just to go back to one of the examples I gave you, I have an IT consultant. He does a great job. His name's Dave. Dave helps me manage my cybersecurity risk. And the risk of just downtime, just having our systems down, because that's expensive for a small business. He is the expert there. If I tried to manage that risk on my own, I would expose us to danger because I am not the domain expert. Dave is the domain expert. I trust him and I rely on him to keep us protected. Now, that doesn't mean I think Dave makes us bulletproof or invincible, but I know he does a better job than I would managing that particular risk of our kind of business because Dave is the domain expert. What about a lack of business expertise? What happens when you don't have that? So you're going to have an inability to make a reasonable profit or a reasonable return on investment if you don't have the right business expertise. I think eventually it will lead to the failure of the business. In the meantime, while you wait for the business to fail, a lack of business expertise is going to give you a bad experience for employees, business partners, and clients. And FYI, I think this is a model a lot of land surveyors run. That's why the subtitle for this episode was Why Surveyors Suck at Running Their Shop. They suck at running their shop because they don't have the right business expertise. So they're not a good boss. They don't provide good client service. They aren't a good business partner. And so, I might do a PYBO Team Extra and just talk about, kind of what that model looks like. And it's usually smaller survey shops. They don't have good business expertise, and we can talk about what are the mistakes that they make, common mistakes that I see. So when you think about what happens when you don't have both, it's critical, right, to have both. So ask yourself, you can do a little self-evaluation here, right? And I try and do this at Redefine Horizons. Ask yourself, do I have enough domain expertise and enough business expertise? So, let's just go through that list again. Am I turning my core capabilities into value for clients or stakeholders? Do I overestimate my ability to perform and underestimate my challenges? Do I expose my organization to unnecessary risk or liability? Am I making a reasonable profit? Am I providing a good place to work, good client service, and do I have a good relationship with my business partners? If you aren't checking enough of those boxes, then you may lack either domain expertise or business expertise. And I think for most land surveyors, it's going to be the latter. They're going to be lacking the business expertise. That's why I wanted to do this episode. So how do you fix a lack of business expertise? There's a chance if you're listening to this podcast, and if you're like me, you lack business expertise. Remember I told you when I started Redefine Horizons, I thought I knew how to run a small business. I didn't. I can admit that. I'm still learning. I'm still devouring everything I can to become more of a business expert. So if you're like me and you need help with this, what can you do? So I talked about formal education. It's hard for a working professional and it's probably overpriced, but that's an option. Informal education. We mentioned that's the route I took. Business books, business magazines, business podcasts. You can start listening to a couple good business podcasts. Excuse me for that sneeze. You could start doing that on your commute tomorrow.
It will make a difference. You will learn things. So don't be overwhelmed when you listen to this and feel like you got to go get a bachelor's degree in business administration. You don't. You can start small, but make an effort to start integrating some business education into your routine. I talked about get experience running a business, right? Run a side hustle. Treat it like a real business, even if it's a lemonade stand. And we're going to do BYB OTM Extra on why surveyors should run a lemonade stand before they start a business. I think that's what we'll call it. And we'll talk about what might you learn running a lemonade stand. So just do something. Don't be a land surveyor with great domain expertise and horrible business expertise. Do one or more of those things I talked about. Formal education, informal education, experience running a business. Like I mentioned, if you're working as a project surveyor somewhere, and you're like, Landon's right, I need more business expertise. Go to your boss. Tell him, hey, what can I do to learn more about how the business runs? Can I volunteer some of my time to learn some of that? Go to a friend or a family member that owns a farm or a restaurant or a logging company or a janitorial company and say, I need to learn more about running a business. Can you teach me that? If I donate some of my time, can I learn how you manage your cash flow, how you do your marketing, how you run your schedule? Do that stuff before you start a business. I'm begging you, please, from one extremely humbled land surveyor to another. Get some of that experience before you start a business. I will tell you, I think I was more prepared to start my survey business than I think a lot of surveyors were, because I had an entrepreneurial father and I had a lot of management experience, and I had 15 plus years of experience before I started RH. It wasn't enough. So don't make the mistake I made. Get more prepared. If all else fails, pay for the business expertise you need. So you might hire a consultant or a partner that has business expertise. And that's one of the reasons why I hired Brian, my partner Brian. Besides the fact that he's a UAV wizard, he has he went to school for business and he's got a good business background. He understands a lot of the things we talk about on the podcast, and so he helps me. So at a minimum, you need to do that. There's another so. I apologize. Now I want you to pat yourself on the back a little bit, commend yourself. You're listening to this podcast, which is a start. Now, I don't want to pretend like this podcast is going to solve all your business expertise problems. It isn't. But it's a start. Listen to other podcasts, because I don't have all the answers. Read books and business magazines. Subscribe to the Wall Street Journal or the Economist magazine. Get other exposure. This podcast is not enough, but commend yourself. This is a start. And that's why I wanted to start the podcast, guys, is because I felt like this message needed to get out to land surveyors who are either in a management position or thinking about running their own business, and we need to do a better job of it. I need to do a better job of it. And so that's the goal of this podcast, is to help us be better business people as surveyors and mappers. We want to be excellent surveyors and mappers. And I could have started a podcast on how to be an excellent surveyor or how to be an excellent mapper. But I feel like there's a lot of good information out there about how to do that. There's not a lot of good information about how to be a good land surveyor and mapper and a good business person. That's why I started the Putting Your Business on the Map podcast. Okay, in conclusion, what did we talk about today? We talked about what is business expertise. We started with what is domain expertise. Then we talked about what is business expertise. Then we talked about why is everybody trying to hire the same surveyor? And it's because both of those things are important, and employers undervalue that. The individuals that have both business expertise and domain expertise. And then we talked about how might you know if your business is lacking one of those two things. Like, what are the problems of not having domain expertise or not having business expertise? And we talked about, I don't know, there's 6 or 7 or 8 things that you can look for. And then finally we talked about if you're like me and you're a land surveyor that lacks business expertise, what can you do to fix that? We talked about 3 or 4 different things you could do. Run a lemonade stand. All right, next episode is finding good clients. So we're going back to that series, qualifying leads and controlling proposal costs. So we're going to talk about what is a qualified lead. What's a cold lead versus a hot lead or a warm lead, and what's an unqualified lead and a qualified lead. What are the differences? And then how do you control your proposal costs? It's a really important thing. I didn't do a good job of it the first year or two here at Redefine Horizons. We've gotten much better at it. I spend much less time on proposals now. So I felt like it would be valuable to share that with the listeners. So we'll do that next. And I want to thank Redefine Horizons for sponsoring this episode of our podcast. Appreciate that. Remember, you can reach out to Redefine Horizons if you need help managing your land surveying or civil engineering data in a GIS. You can start with an open source GIS like QGIS. So reach out to the folks at Redefine Horizons if you're interested in that, or you could use help with that. And then I've got another little resource I'm going to point you guys to. Greg Ones has an article he recently wrote and some project management software he's creating for surveyors. So I'm going to give him a little plug here at the end of the episode. But I wanted to thank Redefine Horizons for being our sponsor. If you would like to sponsor the podcast, let me know. If you have a quality product or service for land surveyors, or you have a job opening for a senior land surveyor and you want to reach the audience that I'm speaking to, reach out to me. We can get you plugged in on the podcast here. And so thank you everybody for listening. Appreciate it. And we'll catch you on episode, I believe it'll be 23.
I'm taking a minute at the end of this episode to point you guys to an article by land surveyor Greg Ones. The title of the article is Preventive Tactics in Surveying, Curbing Client Issues Early. I believe it's the first article in a series of articles that Greg is going to write about good communication with your clients as a land surveyor and a survey business owner. It's a good article. Skim through it. Read it. It's got good suggestions in there. For example, it talks about monitoring your jobs and having open communication with the client, which I believe are important. So it's a good article. Greg reached out to me and asked if I would share that, and so I wanted to do that on the podcast. I think we need, as land surveyors, we need to talk more about this, right? So Greg is, like me, Greg is trying to help land surveyors be better business owners, and I think that's an extremely beneficial and healthy thing for the profession. So I wanted to point you guys to that article. We are going to put a link to it in the show notes. I'll try and remember to have Carly do that for me. But it's on the website for Kaduru Stone. Kaduru Stone is the project management software that Greg and his company produce. So if you're not using a good project management tool right now, or you don't like the one you got, so if you're running your business in Microsoft Excel, or you're trying to use a project like Microsoft Project, which might be overkill for your business, check out this product. Check out that product by Greg, and check out some of the articles that he's got on his website. He's doing a good job of educating land surveyors about business issues. Like I said, I think that's super healthy. We need more of that. So I wanted to give Greg a shout out at the end of this episode. Thanks, Greg, for your work, and I look forward to seeing you succeed in your business, helping surveyors with their project management. As we wrap up the podcast today, I want to do a couple things. I want to let you guys know where you can find the podcast, and I also want to let you know how you can support the podcast if you've enjoyed it. So let's start with that first thing. Where can you find the podcast? The podcast lives on the web at landonblake.com/PYBOTM. So if you go to my website, landonblake.com, up at the top, you'll find a menu. Go to Learn. It's the second link in the Learn menu. That'll take you right to the podcast. We have got links to download all the episodes there in MP3 format, and we also have the show notes. You can also find the podcast on YouTube, youtube.com/@PYBOTM. All of the episodes are also uploaded there. We have the podcast on Spotify, so you can find the podcast in all of those places. Second thing, how can you support the podcast? There's a few different ways you can do that. If you'd like to sponsor the podcast, reach out to me with an email, phone call, or text message. We can talk about your job opportunity for senior land surveyors, or if you have a high-quality product or service for land surveyors and mappers, we can also talk about that on the podcast. You can also subscribe to the podcast on YouTube or Spotify. Tell a friend about the podcast. Share one of your favorite episodes on social media for us. And then finally, if you'd like to make a real difference you can go to the On Point Workshops page at Patreon. We've got a tier there, membership tier for $20 a month. You can join and support the podcast, and you get extras. We call them PYBOTM extras there. So we try and do 1 or 2 extras from each episode, video and audio, as just a little thank you to the folks that support us for $20 a month. So if you got the price of a medium pizza in your budget and you want to support the podcast, the best way to do that is on Patreon. That will help me pay for Carly. Carly is the virtual assistant and digital marketing extraordinaire that helps me with all of the unseen back-end work on the podcast. So editing, maintaining the webpage, doing the show notes, that kind of stuff. Carly's great. I'd like to keep her around. One way you can help me do that is by becoming a subscriber or a member on Patreon. So appreciate everybody that's done that already, and I also appreciate the thank you notes I've gotten from several of you for the podcast. That makes a difference. I know everybody's busy. I appreciate you guys taking some time out of your busy schedule to send a thank you note. So please support the podcast, and we will catch you guys on the next episode. Thanks.